Welcome to The Hypnotist, the show that gives you inside access to cutting-edge hypnosis with real clients facing genuine issues. Brought to you by the hypnotherapist demanded by celebrities, CEOs, and even royalty, Adam Cox. These recordings took place live from Adam's clinic in London's world-famous Harley Street. This podcast features powerful hypnosis, so do not listen while driving or operating machinery. This recording is not suitable for those with epilepsy or severe mental health issues. So, get yourself comfortable and enjoy today's episode of The Hypnotist.
Hi, it's Adam here, and in this episode of The Hypnotist, you'll be listening to a hypnosis session that I did with a client that was trying to avoid history repeating itself by starting to have very clear boundaries in his relationships. What he found is that because he didn't really have that internal clarity of where his boundaries were, quite often he would find himself being too empathetic or too considerate when he was kind of on the receiving end of something which was perhaps unfair, rude, or disrespectful. But when it was the other way around, he found himself crossing the lines of other people's boundaries, and then receiving the consequence of that. And his coping strategy, if a boundary he intuitively felt was crossed, even if he couldn't articulate specifically where it was, is to try and seek some kind of explanation or insight into what the intention was or what actually happened, to figure out if this was intentional, malicious, or just a misunderstanding. But the problem with that is that because there was a lack of clarity over his own boundaries, it came across to the women that he was in a relationship with that he was trying to control them rather than express his own boundaries and how he was feeling. So what you're going to hear in this particular hypnosis session is designed to create a metaphor of something valuable that needs to be protected, but not protected at all costs. And one of the key things that I think is a mistake when thinking about relationships is, and this can happen when you get people in codependent relationships, and you can get this when people become obsessed or infatuated with an individual, is that almost no matter what they do or what they say, nothing is going to deter them from wanting to be in a relationship with that person. And the problem with that is that it can lead to the possibility of very toxic relationships, because if no matter what the other person does, you're still committed to that relationship, then you're giving a lot of that power away. Now, the purpose of boundaries isn't to have an easy way of exiting relationships, but more to establish certain kind of areas of respect, that if the relationship is going to be viable and worthwhile, then it should, of course, be collaborative. It shouldn't be one person extracting value from the other person, no matter what the gender is. It should be a collaborative partnership at some level. And these boundaries are always going to be subjective depending on who's in the relationship. So a lot of people will have fidelity. So if someone cheats on them, that's an absolute red line, and therefore the relationship's over. But that could be relevant to someone that values exclusivity, but to someone that believes in, polyamorous relationships or open relationships, that might not be a red line, but it might be respect or communication being the key red line. And you can have red lines in different areas. The definition, when you hear that in this hypnosis session, of a red line is that if that line gets crossed, then the relationship's over. And the representation of a black line is the black line. If the black line gets crossed, that means that something needs to be discussed and clarified and worked on rapidly to avoid it getting to a red line and therefore the relationship's over. And of course, the best way of dealing with any of these boundaries is to have absolute clarity in yourself as to what you value and what your boundaries are, and to communicate them in a non-controlling way to your partner, so you just know where you stand. And effectively, in many ways, you can think of laws in any country that you're living right now as a form of boundaries. Most people know that if you commit certain crimes and you get caught, that could lead to a very long prison sentence, and therefore that becomes a red line. And then there's other things that are more kind of like social norms. Most people don't run down a street naked, for example. So therefore you have other boundaries which aren't necessarily illegal, but they don't fit with the cultural kind of narrative. Now, most people don't break the laws, and most people don't break social norms because they're aware of them. And awareness is one of the key ways of avoiding conflict, and communication is another way. So if you think of children, they don't necessarily know what's acceptable and not. So it doesn't make sense to punish a child for doing something that they didn't know was wrong. Better to have a conversation, communication with them, so therefore that they know if they continue to, let's say, cross that line, even when they know that it's unacceptable, well, then some kind of discipline or consequences is kind of naturally makes sense. The point I'm making here is that it's very, very beneficial and useful to both parties in a relationship to have clarity over the boundaries and to know in advance as to what you would do if those boundaries get crossed, and therefore you could avoid a lot of misunderstandings and issues. The metaphor here in this hypnosis session is a fire, and each party have the ability to extinguish the fire, but only if they feel that one of their lines has been crossed and then the relationship is irretrievable. So there's a lot of metaphor in here, but the objective is to help give clarity to you listening as to what your boundaries are, what are your no-go areas in a relationship, and what you would do to resolve issues about crossing boundaries. And I think it makes sense that the default in someone crossing someone else's boundary is to start not with the assumption of malicious intent, but to start with the belief system that it could be accidental or a misunderstanding, so that any kind of conversations are very kind of exploratory and curious based rather than judgmental and accusatory, which tends to not kind of end very well, if that makes sense. So this will be helpful to anyone that feels that they're in relationships that don't serve them, or that they tend to find themselves in a lot of conflict in relationships. Then this hypnosis session might be beneficial. Of course, this was created for someone else. So if you're listening to this and you think it might be useful for you to have certain resource states or more clarity at a unconscious level, and here's the key thing: these boundaries, these kind of no-go areas, they feel intuitive because most of the time they're unconscious. They're not kind of conscious. So if you do feel it would be useful to work with me in this area of your life, there will be a link nearby where you can book a free 30-minute consultation call with me to explore what it would be like to work with me. But for now, find a comfortable place where you won't be disturbed, relax, and enjoy the session. Take a deep breath in. As you breathe in a resourceful feeling of relaxation. And as you exhale, just get a sense that tension is leaving your body in your outward breath. As you breathe in that resourceful feeling of relaxation, notice that as you exhale with your eyes closed, you're able to release even more of that tension. And tension sometimes is subtle. It could be the feeling of holding an expression that you don't need in your forehead. It could be tension in your jaw where you're teeth or lips are connecting and they don't need to. It could be holding an arm or a leg in a position where to move it slightly would create more feelings of comfort and relaxation. As you breathe in and breathe out, just get a sense that you're scanning your body for any feelings of tension. Tension could even be a tightness in the chest. And as you breathe in and breathe out, just release that tension. Tension could be a feeling in your neck, a tightness, and just feel that is melting away like ice cubes in the sunshine, enabling you to go deeper and deeper relaxed. I want you to use the power of your imagination to imagine wilderness. Imagine a time where there's no electricity, no buildings, no homes. I want you to imagine a time where light and heat came from a homemade fire. I want you to imagine it's approaching sunset. And I want you to imagine that there is someone that you care for, that you're building a fire with. Maybe that's collecting the sticks, branches, dry leaves. You've already made the decision that this person is someone worthy to create this fire with. Maybe you've met them on several occasions, you've had lots of conversations, that chemistry is there. You feel good in their presence. They're easy to communicate with. And you've decided that this is someone that is worthy of investing your time and your effort to build something with. And right now you're building a fire. It's not dark yet. And I want you to imagine just before the sun sets, whether it's through friction of sticks or the spark of some flint, imagine that fire catches light. A tiny spark just to begin with connects perhaps with a dry leaf, and then starts to glow, starts to create a flame. And I want you to get a sense that this is now, as the sun sets and you're surrounded perhaps by trees or countryside, a night sky above you, just imagine there is a fire. And I want you to imagine that both you and this other person have a bucket of water. Each of you have the ability to extinguish this fire. In fact, there are holes in this bucket. So just by getting too close to the fire, there is the danger of accidentally extinguishing this fire. And therefore you agree that it's useful to have some clues as to not get too close to the fire. I want you to imagine that a certain distance around the fire, there is a circle all the way round, perhaps made with vine or some kind of rope, and the colour of this is red. And the agreement is between the two of you that if you accidentally or intentionally cross the red line, well, then the fire will be extinguished and put out. And the agreement is that each of you would have to find someone else to build a new fire with. But neither of you want that. You're happy with the fire. You're happy with the company around the fire. You're getting the benefits of that fire, the heat, the warmth, the light. Maybe you're able to cook things. But I want you to get a sense that you're not allowed to get too close to the fire while holding the buckets. I want you to decide in your mind one area of your life that this red rope, this red line represents. Maybe it represents the way that someone communicates. Maybe it just represents trust. That at the point that this red line is crossed, you don't trust them anymore, in which case the fire is extinguished and you move on to another fire. Maybe it's the way in which you collaborate and get on together. The level to which you can work together in partnership and have that flexibility, find the compromises. Maybe it's a certain level of disrespect represents going over that red line. And in your mind, I want you to accept that if the red line is crossed, then you will voluntarily tip your bucket of water on that fire and just walk away. Because if you've both agreed not to cross these red lines, then if either of you does, it's fair for the other person to extinguish the fire and just move on. But neither of you wants that to happen. And then imagine further away from this red rope, you decide that because you don't want to accidentally cross this red line, it makes sense to have another boundary further away from that red line. And I want you to imagine maybe a dark vine or a dark rope further away from the perimeter of the fire. And that creates an even wider circle. And the agreement is that if this black line gets crossed, it's not a reason to extinguish the flames, to put out the fire, but it's essential that some kind of communication takes place to find out why that line was crossed. Was it intentional or accidental? And what can be done to avoid this line being crossed, either intentionally or accidentally at some point in the future? The communication is necessary to decide if this line is in the right place or if it needs to be moved closer to the red line or even further out from the red line. And I want you to think of an area of your life where it would represent not a reason to extinguish the flames, but a reason to have a really sincere, meaningful conversation about what led to that line being crossed. And I want you to see, as the sunrise now appears with the flames still going, that in this wilderness there is so much space that is nowhere near these lines. The lines are but a tiny part of what is going on. The lines are there to protect the valuable fire. It's to keep the flames going. But the goal is not to get dangerously close to any of these lines. The goal is to make the most of all this space you have far away from the lines. I want you to imagine that you're nowhere near the lines and you're just having incredible connection, amazing experiences, moments, memories with this person. Nowhere near the lines. And then I want you to imagine that something happens where this person accidentally crosses the black line. Although your instinct might be to accuse them of deliberately crossing the black line, it's more than plausible that they were having so much fun, appreciating the fire, that they just didn't realize that they crossed that black line. I want your instant emotion not to be critical of them crossing the line, accusatory of them crossing the line, or even feeling like a victim because they've crossed the line, but more that you're curious. What were they thinking about? Where was their attention? What led to them crossing this line? The clues will be in their tonality, their expressions. Your intuition, I want you to imagine as a glowing aura, will give you an idea of when you have these conversations. If the aura glows and gets stronger, then that gives you a sense of reassurance. And if it starts to feel like it's being affected, then maybe you're not getting the assurances that you need. But I want you to operate not from the position of interrogation, of trying to change their behavior, but more to understand their behavior, to find out what their intention was. What emotion are they feeling? What could be done to avoid something like this happening? Because otherwise, this precious fire is at risk. And it doesn't make sense to accidentally destroy something so valuable if both you and they really want to keep this fire alive. I want you to accept the suggestion that if a line is crossed, it's not a requirement that you immediately get the answers to those questions as to why that line was crossed. A day or two, even 3 is fine. Because normally at the point where the line is crossed is the worst possible time to discuss that line being crossed. The opportune time is when that other person is in a loving, kind, understanding state of mind, and your intuition knows when that's the case. But if a red line is crossed, I want you to have absolutely no hesitation in putting out that fire and walking away. In fact, I want you to imagine it happening, that you see this other person intentionally crossing that red line, knowing it's a red line for you, and being defiant, not caring that that line has been crossed. And then imagine that you're picking up a bucket, walking over to the fire and putting out that fire, and deciding that this is not the right person to build a fire with. And the quicker you put out that fire, the more time you have to find someone else that you can really build the right fire with. I want you to get a sense that your job isn't to control, it's to lead and to respond. You have an intention as to the kind of fire that you're building, but if it ever becomes evident that that fire is not possible, the lines are being crossed, then one of your lines is that you don't want to have a fire with someone that isn't also contributing to that fire, isn't also protecting those boundaries. I want you to get a sense that building a fire is a partnership. And therefore, the clearer you are on that fire, on the red line and the black lines, the easier it is to choose the right kind of person to build that fire with. I want your unconscious mind to naturally, intuitively go back and think, what are the appropriate lines to protect that fire? What times in the past should I have just extinguished the fire straight away and walked away? And how would I need to communicate when a line is crossed to not be at risk of crossing someone else's line? Now it's time to leave this place. I want you to leave this playing now, knowing that you've got the opportunity to build a fire with the right person that's right for you, to set those lines in exactly the right place so that they're not too strict and they're not too lenient. They're the right balance to protect what's valuable, but not confine what's valuable. As you realize that all of this are just thoughts within thoughts, ideas within ideas, dreams within dreams, and actually you're now in the present, listening to my voice. Take a deep breath in through your nose and out through your nose. Just wiggle your fingers, wiggle your toes, get a sense that you're in your own physical body with all parts fully integrated into this moment right now, as I now count from 1 to 10 to awaken you. You will awaken feeling positive, with more clarity, knowing that the clearer you are on those lines, the easier it is to build a fire that can grow big and valuable, that is worth protecting and keeping. Starting to count to awaken you. 1, 2, 3, waking up. 4, 5, 6, more alert. 7, 8, open your eyes, open your eyes. 9, 10, wide awake, wide awake, wide awake.
Thank you for listening to The Hypnotist with Adam Cox, the show that gives you inside access to cutting-edge hypnosis with real clients facing genuine issues. To automatically receive the latest episodes, please subscribe. If you'd like to support the show, please share this episode with just one friend you think it could help. And if this episode helped you, please leave us a 5-star review.